What this dad discovered in a hidden recording shocked the nation. Hello and welcome to Stories TH. Today we delve into the critical topic of protecting our kids in the digital era. The online world, while resourceful, harbors hidden dangers that threaten our children's safety. Join us as we uncover these risks and discuss proactive measures to ensure our children's well-being. If you find this information valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, Stories TH, for more insightful content. It was a chilly Monday morning, and as Jordan bent down to tie his 7-year-old daughter Emily's shoelaces, something in her posture struck him as off. She was small and gentle, the kind of child who lit up a room just by entering it. But lately, her eyes had lost their spark. There was a tension in the air that Jordan couldn't quite name, a heaviness that didn't belong to someone so young. As he smiled and tucked her hair behind her ear, she didn't smile back. Her little hands clutched the hem of her shirt, her shoulders stiff, and her lips pressed into a tight line. "Be good at school today, okay, sweetheart?" he said gently. But Emily stayed quiet. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked, kneeling so their eyes could meet. She avoided his gaze, but then, almost in a whisper, said, "Daddy, can I stay home today?" The question sent a chill down his spine. She had never asked that before. She loved school, or at least she used to. Jordan tried to keep his tone calm. "Are you feeling sick? Did something happen at school?" But she only shook her head, her tiny lips trembling. "No, I just don't want to go." Torn between respecting her feelings and fulfilling his responsibility, Jordan pressed gently. "You can tell Daddy anything." A single tear slid down Emily's cheek, and she finally murmured, "It's nothing. I'll go to school." Jordan helped her into the car, but his heart was already heavy. The ride to school was silent. She sat stiffly in the back seat, staring out the window, her little body rigid, as if bracing for something he couldn't see. As they pulled up to the school gate, Jordan turned to her one last time. "Are you sure you don't want to tell me anything?" That's when she looked at him with eyes that broke his soul and asked, "Daddy, if I'm not a good girl, will you still love me?" It hit him like a gut punch. "You're the most wonderful little girl in the world," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Daddy loves you more than anything, always." Emily trembled in his embrace. "Daddy, I'm scared." Jordan could barely hold it together. "What are you scared of?" he asked, but she only shook her head, lips trembling, and bolted into the school before he could ask more. That afternoon, Jordan arrived early to pick her up. He needed to see her face, and when she stepped out of her classroom, pale and expressionless, his stomach dropped. Emily ran into his arms and wouldn't let go. He could feel her tiny body trembling against his chest. Just as he was about to comfort her, a cold voice cut through the moment. "Mr. Jordan?" It was Mrs. Carroll, Emily's new teacher. She looked every bit the stereotypical strict educator, silver hair pulled tightly back, glasses perched perfectly, and eyes like frozen steel. "Emily seems like a very sensitive child," she said with a slight smirk. "She doesn't quite fit in. Perhaps you should teach her to toughen up." Her words made Jordan's blood run cold. "I teach my daughter to be kind," he replied, gripping Emily's hand. "And if there's a problem, I expect the school to support her, not criticize her." Mrs. Carroll gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Mr. Jordan." That night, Jordan couldn't shake the image of Emily's trembling hands or the sadness in her voice. He was in the kitchen when he heard a soft sob from down the hall. Rushing to her room, he found her curled up on her bed, clutching her teddy bear, tears staining her cheeks. He wrapped his arms around her. "Did you have a bad dream?" She nodded. "Someone took me away, and you couldn't find me anymore." Her words hit him like a thunderclap. "I'll never let anyone take you, baby," he whispered. But then she said something that chilled him to his core. "If I tell anyone, they'll take you away, and I'll never see you again." Jordan's chest tightened with dread. "Who told you that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Emily trembled. "No one." But he could see it in her eyes, fear, confusion, and a desperate need to protect him. Something was terribly wrong, and now he was sure of it. He gently kissed her forehead. "Everything will be okay tomorrow," he said aloud. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Not anymore. Not until he found out what or who was hurting his little girl. The moment Ben realized something was deeply wrong with his daughter, everything changed. Emily was just 7, sweet and soft-spoken, with a heart full of innocence. But recently, her eyes told a different story. There was fear there, not the kind you get from a nightmare or a scary movie, but a quiet, constant terror that clung to her like a shadow. That morning, when she asked if she could stay home from school, it felt like a whisper for help. She wouldn't say what was wrong, only that she didn't want to go. Her tiny hands clutched the hem of her shirt, her voice barely audible as she tried to hold back tears. When she asked, "Daddy, if I'm not a good girl, will you still love me?" Ben's heart shattered. Someone was making his little girl feel unworthy of love, and he had to find out who. His gut told him it had something to do with the new teacher, Mrs. Cray, who seemed cold and condescending the day they met. That night, hearing Emily cry in her sleep, he made a desperate decision he would hide a tiny audio recorder inside her favorite hair clip. It wasn't legal, and it wasn't something he ever thought he'd do, but he couldn't ignore the signs anymore. His daughter was suffering, and she was too scared to speak. When Ben finally listened to the recording later that evening, his hands trembled. The harsh slap, the hateful words. "You're useless, just like your father." The cruel laughter, the threats telling Emily that if she spoke up, her father would be arrested, and she'd be taken away and sent to an orphanage. It was every parent's worst nightmare come to life. His little girl had been living through daily abuse, and the very people who were supposed to protect her, her teacher and the school administration, were complicit. Furious, Ben stormed into the principal's office, demanding action, but instead of concern, he was met with a smirk. "You think a little recording can do anything?" the principal sneered, warning Ben to back off or risk losing custody of Emily. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a system designed to silence victims and protect abusers. That night, Ben didn't sleep. Instead, he called his old college friend, Michael, now an investigative journalist. This had to be exposed. They needed to go public. As the article hit the press and went viral online, something incredible began to happen. Other parents came forward, mothers and fathers, who had noticed changes in their children, but out of fear or uncertainty, hadn't spoken up. Emily's story gave them the courage to share their own. The community rallied behind Ben, and the silence that once shielded the school began to crack. But the backlash came just as fast. There were threats, anonymous messages, rumors spread to discredit Ben. Still, he pressed forward. For Emily. For every child who had been hurt. His heart ached each time he looked at his daughter, who still flinched at loud sounds and peeked over her shoulder as if expecting someone to strike. But little by little, she began to smile again, to play with her stuffed animals, to eat her cereal without pushing it around the bowl. He knew healing wouldn't come overnight, but at least she was safe. Eventually, the pressure became too much for the school to ignore. Police launched a formal investigation. Parents testified. Secret video clips from brave students surfaced. Mrs. Cray was arrested. The principal was suspended and later charged with obstruction. Justice was finally being served. Still, for Ben, the victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the quiet moment when Emily looked up at him with clear eyes and whispered, "I knew you'd protect me, Daddy." That was the moment he knew every sleepless night, every battle, had been worth it. This wasn't just a story of a father saving his daughter. It was a story of refusing to be silent, of breaking a toxic cycle, of shining a light into the darkest corners of a system that had long gone unchecked. It was a message to every parent out there. Your voice matters, your instincts are valid, and your love, fierce and unwavering, has the power to move mountains. Number 3. The moment Mark pressed play on the tiny recorder he had hidden in his daughter's hair clip, his world came crashing down. Static gave way to the chilling voice of someone he had tried to trust, Mrs. Holloway, his daughter Mia's teacher. "It's your turn today," she said coldly, before the sharp sound of a slap echoed from the speakers. Mark's stomach twisted. his fingers clenched around the edge of his desk, knuckles whitening. "You're useless, just like your father. No one will ever love you." The venom in her voice made Mark's heart pound with fury. He heard Mia's small, choked sobs, her soft apology. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." And then Mrs. Holloway again, cruel and deliberate. "Sorry? Someone as pathetic as you knows how to say sorry?" The real horror came next, a threat so vile it made Mark go cold. "If you tell anyone, I'll say your father's a criminal. The police will come and take him away, and you'll be all alone in an orphanage." Silence followed, then Mia's terrified whisper, "No." That was the moment something snapped inside Mark. He had feared something was wrong, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The woman entrusted with his daughter's safety was the one shattering her spirit, day after day. He couldn't wait. He couldn't sleep on it. Fueled by righteous anger and a father's fierce love, Mark grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house. He drove straight to Principal Warren's home, ignoring the late hour. When the man opened the door, irritation written across his face, Mark didn't let him speak. He thrust his phone forward and hit play. Warren's face paled as the audio filled the air, but when the recording ended, he looked up with a smirk. "You think this little recording will change anything? Mrs. Holloway has powerful friends. Make too much noise and you might just lose your daughter." That was the final straw. Mark punched him square in the jaw. Blood dripped from Warren's lip as he stumbled back. "You've made a big mistake," the principal warned. "If any of you hurt my daughter again, I'll destroy you," Mark growled before storming off. Back home, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, Mark called his closest friend, Nathan. "We need help. We need the press." Nathan didn't hesitate. He knew someone, Daniel Reeves, a respected investigative journalist. Mark sent him the audio and every detail he had. The next day, the two met in a quiet cafe, and Daniel didn't waste time. "This is solid, but we'll need more. If we're going to bring down a system, not just a person, we need an army." From that moment, Mark and Daniel became a team. Mark knocked on doors. He talked to other parents. Most were scared. Some had been threatened. Some had already lost jobs. But slowly, one by one, they started talking. They shared stories of their children's fear, strange bruises, and sudden nightmares. Daniel compiled the evidence into an article so damning, so detailed, it would be impossible to ignore. The day it went live, it was like lighting a match in a room filled with gas. Social media exploded. News outlets picked up the story. Parents rallied outside the school. Children came forward, and for the first time in weeks, Mia smiled. "Daddy," she said, "I think you're winning." But it wasn't over. Principal Warren tried to dismiss the claims as exaggerated. Mrs. Holloway went silent, hiding behind legal threats. But the pressure was relentless. The police were forced to open a formal investigation. Daniel kept publishing updates, making sure the public didn't forget. Videos surfaced, recordings from students' phones showing Mrs. Holloway screaming, slamming books, and making veiled threats. The dam had burst. When the day came that officers escorted Holloway and Warren out of the school in handcuffs, the entire town watched in stunned silence. Mark stood at the gates, Mia by his side, her tiny hand in his. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Mark said, his voice breaking. "We did." Because it hadn't been just him. It had been every scared parent who chose to speak, every child who dared to share their pain, and one brave little girl who clung to her daddy even when she was told it would cost her everything. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing. It was about making sure no other child ever sat alone in fear, thinking they weren't loved. Mark knew the road ahead would be hard. There would be legal battles, attempts to downplay the truth, efforts to rebuild what had been broken. But he also knew this. Silence would never win again. Because one small hair clip had held a voice, and that voice had changed everything. The morning Anthony walked into the school office with his fists clenched and his heart pounding, he knew there was no going back. The war for his daughter's safety had begun in silence, but today it would be heard by the world. After weeks of feeling helpless, watching Lucy wither into a shell of the bright little girl he once knew, Anthony had finally taken the fight to the front lines. He wasn't alone anymore. Other parents had begun to rally, whispering encouragement in hushed voices, their own fears finally eclipsed by rage. The recording, the press article, the broadcasted truth, it was all out there now, and there was no more hiding. As Anthony and the investigative journalist Daniel Ramsey pushed open the heavy doors of the conference room, the air inside thickened with tension. Eyes turned, some hostile, some ashamed, but most terrified. Principal Harris sat stone-faced, flanked by a few remaining staff who had chosen silence over integrity for far too long. Beside him, Mrs. Dawson looked nothing like the powerful figure who once ruled her classroom with cruelty and fear. She looked haunted. But Anthony didn't care about her shame. He wanted justice. He wanted her to see what she had done to his daughter, to all their children. He looked Harris in the eye, his voice razor-sharp. "What do you think about today's article?" The room fell into a suffocating hush. Harris tried to muster dignity, but his words were brittle, hollow. He talked about process and discretion, about protecting the school's image, as if any of that could justify what had happened under his watch. Anthony didn't let him finish. "You call this fair? A teacher abusing children, threatening them into silence, and you did nothing. Worse, you protected her." Daniel stood beside Anthony, calm but searing in tone. "The police will be here tomorrow. We have enough to proceed. You can't stop this now." And he was right. There were recordings, testimony from parents, students, and even whispers from frightened faculty. The truth had taken root and was growing into something powerful, irrefutable. The next day, the world began to watch. News reports exploded across platforms. Television anchors discussed the tragedy, and social media buzzed with outrage. Videos of other victims emerged, shaky phone footage of Mrs. Dawson screaming, slapping, humiliating. Parents cried on camera. The narrative could no longer be buried by bureaucracy. Dawson was suspended. Harris placed under review. But Anthony knew it wasn't enough. He needed to see accountability. Still, amid the chaos, he returned home to find Lucy sitting quietly in the living room. Her posture still timid, her eyes cautious, but for the first time in weeks, her shoulders weren't hunched with dread. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you think it's safe to go back to school now?" Anthony knelt beside her, brushed a hand through her hair, and said gently, "Only when you feel ready, sweetheart. And when you do, I'll be right beside you." That night, Anthony didn't sleep. He stayed up, answering messages from parents who had once been too afraid to speak, but now found courage in his fight. Some promised to testify. Others begged forgiveness for not joining sooner. It didn't matter to Anthony. What mattered was that the tide had turned. Fear no longer had the final word. Days passed. Police launched a full investigation, and more evidence spilled into the open. Witnesses spoke of years of intimidation, emotional trauma, and administrative cover-ups. One by one, the cracks in the school's foundation began to show. Mrs. Dawson's facade crumbled under the weight of years of hidden cruelty. Principal Harris could no longer hide behind policy or power. He had chosen silence. He had chosen to protect the abuser. And now, he too would face the consequences. When Dawson was finally arrested, the school felt like a battlefield, where the victors were the children and the parents who refused to stay quiet. She was handcuffed in front of staff and students. The whispers that once followed her now turned into gasps. Anthony stood silently across the courtyard, watching not with satisfaction, but with a calm that only truth could bring. In the following weeks, Anthony continued to fight. He worked with Daniel and community leaders to reform the school board's oversight. He helped parents file complaints. He met with counselors and educators to create safer learning environments. But most of all, he stayed present for Lucy. At night, she no longer clutched her teddy bear with tears in her eyes. Her laughter returned, slowly but surely. And one evening, as they sat together under the soft glow of the kitchen light, Lucy looked up and said, "I'm not scared anymore, Daddy." Anthony smiled, tears welling up. "I knew you'd be brave, just like your mom." He held her close, knowing the road ahead would still be long. But now, he had hope. He had his daughter's trust. And together, they had reclaimed the light from the shadows. Even after the arrest of Mrs. Dawson and the suspension of Principal Harris, Anthony's heart couldn't rest. The relief was there, but so was the unease. Justice might have cracked the surface, But Anthony knew better than to believe it ended there. He had learned the hard way how power could protect the wicked, how systems wrapped in polished smiles could rot underneath. And now, even with the spotlight on them, Dawson and Harris still had silent supporters, people in high places trying to smooth things over, to make it all quietly disappear. But Anthony wasn't about to let that happen. Not after what Lucy had endured, not after what so many other children had suffered in silence. Each morning, he scrolled through countless messages from other parents, some offering support, others sharing long-suppressed stories. They'd been afraid, beaten down by fear of retaliation, worried about jobs, reputations, or their kids being singled out. But now the truth had emboldened them. What had started as one father's desperate search for answers had become a rising movement. The media coverage had only intensified. Lucy's story, and those like hers, were lighting up headlines across the nation. Talk shows debated the dangers of unchecked authority in schools. Editorials called for reform, and people were listening. Anthony met again with Daniel Ramsey, the journalist who had become more like a comrade in battle. They planned a second wave of reports this time, revealing deeper corruption, connections between Harris and school board officials, and a history of ignored complaints. But Daniel had another idea too. He wanted to give the survivors a voice. Not just Anthony, but Lucy when she was ready, and the other children who had been harmed. With the parents' consent and anonymity protected, Daniel proposed a special televised interview segment that could bring raw emotion into living rooms across America. Let people see the damage, he said, not just the headlines. Let them feel it. Anthony hesitated. The thought of Lucy reliving her pain under any spotlight sent a jolt of panic through him. But Lucy surprised him. One evening, as they sat together on the back porch, she turned to him and asked, "Daddy, if I tell people what happened to me, will it help other kids too?" Anthony felt a lump rise in his throat. He nodded, barely able to speak. "Yes, sweetheart, it might save someone else from getting hurt." Lucy didn't say another word, but her small hand reached for his, and he understood. She was ready, in her own way. The televised segment aired 2 weeks later. Faces blurred, voices softened, but the message was crystal clear. Children spoke of fear, of pain, of long days filled with dread. One little boy sobbed as he described being called worthless. A girl described being locked in a storage closet. Lucy's voice came through steady but soft as she said, "I didn't tell my daddy because she said he'd be taken away. But I wanted to. Every day I wanted to." The footage ended with Anthony holding his daughter, his face filled with equal parts love and agony. The response was immediate. Thousands of emails flooded Daniel's inbox. Lawmakers began demanding accountability from the school board. National advocates for children's rights reached out to Anthony. He had gone from a concerned parent to a symbol of resistance, and while the weight of that wasn't something he asked for, he accepted it fully. Back at the school, change began rippling through the walls. The board launched an independent investigation. Staff who had turned a blind eye were quietly dismissed. New teachers, vetted with higher scrutiny, stepped in. Counselors were hired to help students heal, and most importantly, the parents once silenced now had a voice. They organized meetings, formed committees, demanded transparency, and they got it. One bright spring morning, Anthony stood outside the school gates again, watching as Lucy walked in with a bounce in her step he hadn't seen in months. She turned before entering, flashed him a shy smile, and waved. Anthony smiled back, heart full. For the first time, he didn't feel fear watching her go. He felt pride, strength, hope. He knew the battle wasn't over. There would always be more to fix, more to protect. But he also knew this: silence had lost. Darkness had been dragged into the light, and a little girl's quiet courage had changed everything. That evening, Anthony sat with Lucy as she showed him a drawing she'd made at school, a picture of them holding hands, standing in front of a big building labeled Safe School. She had drawn a sun in the sky and a rainbow above it. "Is that us?" Anthony asked gently. Lucy nodded. "It's our school now, not hers." Anthony hugged her close, the tears he'd held back for weeks finally falling. "That's right, sweetheart. It's yours, and I'll make sure it stays that way." The day Mrs. Dawson was arrested, A heavy silence fell over the school, broken only by the stunned whispers of children and the gasps of parents who never thought they'd see justice in action. For Anthony, standing on the sidewalk clutching his phone, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like release. The woman who had poisoned his daughter's spirit with cruelty and fear was finally being held accountable. But even in that moment, as he watched the handcuffs click into place and cameras flash, he knew it wasn't over. Principal Harris was still hiding behind his title, and the wounds Dawson left weren't ones that disappeared overnight. Lucy's school had become a battleground. Every hallway, every classroom echoed with trauma. But slowly, the tide was turning. Parents were no longer whispering behind closed doors. They were speaking out, organizing, writing letters, showing up at meetings, and demanding change. Anthony had lit the spark, but now the fire was spreading. Still, none of it came easy. In the days that followed the arrest, the investigation expanded. Police discovered emails between Harris and school board members, evidence of complaints that had been deliberately buried. Former students started coming forward, some now in high school or college, carrying scars from their time under Dawson's care. Their testimonies painted a horrifying picture of years of unchecked abuse, protected by layers of silence and red tape. And now, that system was crumbling. Anthony found himself at the center of it all, fighting not just for Lucy, but for every child who had been hurt and every parent who had once felt powerless. Yet, behind closed doors, he was still a dad, still waking up in the middle of the night to check if Lucy was breathing calmly, still watching her for signs of fear, still aching when she flinched at sudden sounds or looked over her shoulder without realizing it. One morning, Anthony received a call from the district attorney's office. They were formally charging both Mrs. Dawson and Principal Harris with criminal negligence and child endangerment. The case was going public. Court proceedings would begin within weeks. And Anthony, who once only wanted to know why his daughter was scared, was now a key witness. He was ready. But Lucy came first. They sat on the couch together that night, her legs curled under a blanket, eyes watching cartoons, but not really watching. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "will she ever come back?" Anthony wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "No, sweetheart, she's gone, and she's never going to hurt anyone again." Lucy hesitated. "Promise?" "I promise." For the first time, she leaned against him and didn't tremble. Across town, news outlets were buzzing with the story. Daniel Ramsey, the journalist who had helped Anthony break it all wide open, was now covering the trial daily. Public outrage grew louder. Teachers from other schools began reaching out to share similar experiences, exposing a pattern that stretched far beyond one classroom. What had started as one man's desperate plea for the truth had become a spotlight on an entire system in need of change. The courtroom was packed on the day of the preliminary hearing. Reporters, parents, victims, it was standing room only. When Anthony took the stand, his voice didn't shake. He told them about the clip in Lucy's hair, the recording, the moment he realized his child was being emotionally tortured by someone entrusted to protect her. And he didn't stop there. He laid bare the threats, the intimidation, the silence of those who should have stepped in. When he finished, there were tears in the eyes of strangers. The judge ruled that the case would proceed to trial. It was a major blow to the defense and a victory for every person who had ever been told to keep quiet for the good of the school. Back at home, Anthony tucked Lucy into bed. She looked up at him, sleepy-eyed, and whispered, "Did we win?" He kissed her forehead. "We're still fighting, but we're not alone anymore." Weeks passed, and the trial became national news. More evidence emerged. Dawson's misconduct went back nearly 2 decades. Harris had covered for her every time. In the end, both were convicted. Dawson was sentenced to prison, and Harris was banned from ever working in education again. But justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about healing. The school began to rebuild. New leadership, trauma counselors, and parent committees ensured no child would fall through the cracks again. Lucy returned to class. Her first day back, she wore the sky blue hair clip that once hid a secret. This time, it was just a hair clip, and that felt like a miracle. That evening, Anthony stood outside her room, listening to her hum softly as she colored. No fear, just childhood. He wiped a tear from his cheek. They had made it. Not without pain, not without cost, But they had walked through fire and come out stronger. And now, Anthony understood something deeper. Real justice isn't just about punishment. It's about protecting the next child before they ever have to be saved. As the story spread through national headlines and the courtroom proceedings intensified, something remarkable began to take shape. Something Anthony never expected when he first clipped that tiny recording device into his daughter's hair. A movement. What started as one desperate father's quest to protect his daughter from an abusive teacher had now become a rallying cry across schools, neighborhoods, and parenting forums. Mothers and fathers who had once felt silenced or intimidated suddenly found their voices. Communities from across the country began flooding online comment sections, sharing similar stories of mistreatment, negligence, and intimidation within their children's schools. For Anthony, it was both overwhelming and deeply validating. He had exposed a truth that many had been too scared to say aloud. And now, people were standing up not only for Lucy, but for every child who had been harmed under the guise of discipline and silence. The media dubbed it the Lucy Clip Case. Talk shows, podcasts, even major networks ran segments dissecting how one little girl's fear helped uncover a web of systemic abuse and cover-up. Anthony was invited to speak on live TV, but he declined most appearances, choosing instead to focus on being present for Lucy, reading her bedtime stories, taking slow walks to help her process the changes, and holding her hand through the nightmares that still hadn't completely faded. He wasn't interested in fame, he wanted change, but his quiet strength became the very thing that drew people in. Advocacy groups reached out, offering resources, lawyers, and support for other parents who feared retaliation. Petitions circulated demanding reform in school reporting systems and stronger background checks for educators. Districts across the country scrambled to review their policies. Several states opened inquiries into their schools' handling of past abuse complaints. It wasn't just about Mrs. Dawson or Principal Harris anymore. It was about how many people had looked the other way. Daniel Ramsey, the journalist who had risked his career by running the expose, was now seen as a hero in the press world. And yet, even he credited Anthony for the bravery it took to not only record the abuse, but to pursue justice when everyone around him warned him to back down. "He's not just a father," Daniel said in an interview. "He's a reminder that when we protect our children, we're also protecting our future." Through it all, Lucy began to change. She smiled more. She drew pictures again. Her eyes, once filled with silent fear, began to reflect something else: hope. On her first day back at school, now under entirely new leadership, she held Anthony's hand tightly. "Do you think it's okay now?" she asked. He knelt down beside her and gently smoothed her hair. "It's better, and it's going to keep getting better. Because of you." The principal had been replaced. Mrs. Dawson was awaiting trial, and numerous teachers were either suspended or under investigation. The school board, previously silent, had issued a public apology. But Anthony wasn't looking for apologies. He wanted accountability, and that's what he was getting. Community meetings began popping up across cities, featuring Anthony as a guest speaker, not because he wanted to be the face of a movement, but because parents needed someone to guide them through the darkness. He spoke simply, always beginning and ending with Lucy. "If my daughter hadn't trusted me just enough to say she was scared, I might have never known. That's what terrifies me the most, how many kids never get to say those words out loud." Anthony's experience became a blueprint for grassroots change. Parents began installing better communication tools at home. Educators started undergoing additional training on trauma response. Even lawmakers introduced the Lucy Act, a proposed bill that would increase protections for student whistleblowers and enforce strict consequences for school officials who ignore abuse reports. One evening, Anthony received a package in the mail. Inside was a sky blue ribbon and a letter from a little girl in another state. It read, "Thank you for being brave. Now I know it's okay to tell someone when I'm scared." He held the ribbon in his hands for a long time. That night, Lucy crawled into his lap while he sat on the porch. "Daddy, are you still sad sometimes?" she asked. He nodded. "But I'm also proud and lucky." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Me too." And in that quiet, with the stars blinking overhead and the world slowly turning towards something better, Anthony understood something deeper than justice. One voice can spark 1,000, and one small act of courage can protect generations. As the dust began to settle and the headlines faded into the background, Anthony found himself reflecting not only on the chaos of the last few weeks, but on the profound transformation it had sparked in his own life. What had begun with a trembling question from his daughter, "Daddy, will you still love me if I'm not a good girl?" had unraveled into a storm of injustice, fear, and ultimately, justice. Yet now, in the soft, uncertain calm that followed, Anthony realized the journey wasn't just about protecting Lucy from harm. It had become a path toward something even more meaningful: healing. The house was quieter now. Not the haunted kind of silence that used to linger after Lucy's nightmares or the tension that filled the air when she flinched at shadows. This silence was warm, peaceful. She was starting to smile again, not just polite smiles, but those full, gap-toothed grins that lit up her whole face. She was drawing again, coloring pages with sunflowers, puppies, and stick-figure families holding hands. Her laughter, once a distant memory, returned like music to Anthony's ears. And yet, he knew healing wasn't a straight line. Some nights, she still curled up in his bed, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her safe from the monsters that once wore teacher's clothes. But the most powerful change wasn't just in Lucy, it was in Anthony himself. He had always loved his daughter more than life, but now that love had evolved into something stronger, an unshakable bond, forged through adversity, like steel through fire. He no longer questioned whether he was doing the right thing. He had walked through the fire and come out the other side, his child still in his arms. That kind of certainty can't be taught. It's earned. The outside world hadn't moved on either. Though the headlines about Mrs. Dawson's arrest and Principal Harris's suspension had begun to fade, the impact had not. Parents from other districts reached out weekly, some to thank him, others seeking guidance. A father from Illinois sent him a handwritten note describing how he found bruises on his daughter's arms and, inspired by Anthony's courage, recorded a confession from a daycare worker. Another mother from Texas messaged him after she filed a formal complaint about a bullying incident her son endured for a year. "If you hadn't gone public, I would have just kept quiet," she wrote. But even as these stories poured in, Anthony tried to remain grounded. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a father who did what he had to do. The real hero, he always said, was Lucy. Because despite everything, despite the trauma and the fear, she never gave up. She was the reason he never stopped fighting. One evening, as they sat in the backyard with the grill smoking and fireflies blinking across the grass, Lucy looked up and said, "Daddy, I'm not scared of school anymore." Anthony felt something shift in his chest, like a tight knot, slowly loosening. "That's because you're the bravest girl I've ever known," he whispered. She nodded thoughtfully. "And you're the bravest daddy." Still, Anthony knew this peace came with responsibility. He couldn't go back to life as it was before. The injustice he had uncovered, the silence he had broken it, had lit a fire in him that wouldn't be put out. So, when the local school board invited him to speak at a town hall meeting, he accepted. Not because he enjoyed the spotlight, but because he wanted to make sure no other child would have to suffer the way Lucy had. He spoke plainly, directly. "This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every child who's been hurt, silenced, or made to believe that speaking up will cost them everything." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. It came from people who knew what it meant to protect someone you love with everything you have. People who had been afraid, and now, maybe, were a little less so. By the end of the summer, Anthony and Lucy started working on a small book together just for themselves at first. It was called Lucy's Brave Heart, and it told the story of a girl who found her voice and a daddy who listened. They illustrated it with colored pencils and glued in a blue ribbon, just like the one she wore the day she went back to school. "Maybe we can share it with other kids," she said. Anthony smiled. "Maybe we should." Because the truth is, healing doesn't always come from justice alone. It comes from knowing your story mattered, that your pain wasn't ignored, that you were believed, and most of all, that love, real, unconditional, unwavering love, never walked away. And so, while the world kept turning, Anthony and Lucy moved forward step by step. Their lives weren't perfect, but they were real, honest, and built on the kind of strength that can only come from surviving something dark and choosing to live in the light. The moment the arrest was made, It was like the entire school and the community around it let out a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Parents wept, students clung to one another in disbelief, and Anthony stood quietly near the edge of the parking lot, watching the police car disappear with Mrs. Dawson in the back seat. He wasn't cheering or celebrating. He didn't raise his fists in triumph. His victory was quieter, deeper, etched into the soft sigh of his daughter, sleeping safely at home without flinching in her dreams. For Anthony, this wasn't just about one teacher's downfall. It was about the larger truth finally being recognized. A truth that had clawed its way out of whispers and hidden bruises into full daylight. For once, the system that so often protected power had turned its gaze toward justice. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Local and national media picked up the story, some with bold headlines, others with cautious phrasing, but the truth was undeniable. Videos recorded by students, audio from Anthony's brave decision to hide a recorder in Lucy's hair clip, and dozens of parent testimonies painted a horrifying picture of systematic abuse. And for once, no one could sweep it under the rug, not with the nation watching, not with the voices of children echoing through courtrooms and newsrooms alike. Anthony had sparked something, an uprising not of violence or vengeance, but of truth. Inside the school, walls that had once seemed impenetrable now echoed with tension. Principal Harris, who had arrogantly believed he could bury the abuse and protect his own position, now found himself cornered by an investigation that peeled back every layer of corruption he had tried to hide. His alliances couldn't save him, not when parents began showing up en masse to school board meetings, demanding answers, organizing petitions, and filing official complaints. The pressure was relentless and righteous. Anthony wasn't alone anymore. What began as one father's desperate attempt to save his daughter had become a movement. Parents who once looked away out of fear now stood beside him with fiery determination. Charles, his ever-loyal friend, helped coordinate meetings and secure legal advice. Daniel Ramsey, the investigative journalist who took the story public, worked tirelessly to uncover even more wrongdoing and amplify the voices of victims. And Lucy, his sweet, strong little girl, was beginning to feel safe again. That was the real reward. But the road to justice didn't end with headlines. There were legal hearings, public forums, and depositions. Anthony attended everyone. His hands sometimes trembled, but his voice never did. He spoke not only for Lucy, but for every child who had been silenced by fear, every parent who had been gaslighted into doubt, and every teacher who had whispered the truth, but felt powerless to act. "This is not just about one bad apple," he said at a televised hearing. "This is about the soil that let it rot and spread. We need to change the soil." Mrs. Dawson was officially charged with multiple counts of child abuse, emotional endangerment, and professional misconduct. Principal Harris was charged with obstruction, negligence, and conspiracy to cover up abuse. The district scrambled to save face, announcing sweeping reforms and temporary leadership changes. But Anthony and the group of united parents kept pushing. They knew reforms meant little without accountability. As investigations spread to other schools and districts, more families began to come forward. A frightened mother in a nearby county wrote to Anthony saying, "Your bravery gave me the strength to believe my daughter's story. I thought no one would believe us, but they will now." He read that letter again and again, reminded that his fight mattered far beyond the walls of his daughter's classroom. At home, Lucy had started to heal. She was quieter now, but no longer withdrawn. Her eyes had lost that haunted look, replaced with cautious hope. One night, as Anthony tucked her in, she whispered, "Are the bad people gone?" He gently kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, they are, and they can't hurt you anymore." She nodded, clutching her teddy bear a little tighter. That was all he needed. On the final day of the public trial, when the verdicts were read, Anthony didn't cry. He didn't cheer. He simply looked over at Lucy, who sat holding his hand, and smiled. She smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, it reached her eyes. Justice had not only arrived, it had rippled outward, reaching families, communities, and systems long overdue for change. Anthony had become more than a father. He had become a defender of innocence, a challenger of silence, and a voice for the unheard. And in the quiet that followed the storm, he found something stronger than victory. He found peace. After the storm of trials and media coverage finally began to settle, Anthony found himself staring at a world that had changed, yet still felt fragile. The school where his daughter once trembled in fear now stood under new leadership, its hallways scrubbed of the lingering silence that had once protected abusers. Mrs. Dawson was no longer a threat. Principal Harris had been removed and was facing the full force of justice. But despite the headlines and court decisions, Anthony knew this wasn't the end of the story. This was the beginning of rebuilding what had been broken trust, safety, and the delicate innocence his daughter had nearly lost forever. At home, life began to take on a slower rhythm. Lucy was sleeping better. She laughed again, sometimes softly, sometimes loudly, and those moments felt like sunlight after months of winter. She no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. But there were still shadows. Sometimes she hesitated before answering a question. Sometimes she asked, "Are you sure I won't get in trouble?" Anthony would kneel, hold her small hands in his, and say the words she needed to hear, "You're safe now, baby. No one's going to hurt you again." And every time he said it, he meant it more deeply than the last. Anthony himself wasn't the same man he was before all of this began. He had gone from being a quiet father doing his best to a fierce advocate standing against a system that had failed his child. And it wasn't just Lucy's story anymore. He had received messages from parents across the country, some thanking him, others sharing their own nightmares, some begging for advice. The battle had become a beacon, a call to arms for those too afraid to speak until they saw someone else rise. The district had no choice but to respond. After a massive outcry, sweeping educational reforms were announced, stricter teacher evaluations, mental health programs for students, and legal protections for whistleblowers within schools. It wasn't perfect, and Anthony knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step forward, one that had cost him sleepless nights, emotional scars, and the innocence of watching his daughter go to school without fear. Still, he would do it all again, 1,000 times over. There were moments when he questioned how they'd even made it through. Nights when the threats from Mrs. Dawson echoed in Lucy's nightmares. Days when it felt like the system was too big, too corrupt, too indifferent. He remembered the moment he first heard that recording his baby's voice shaking, apologizing, afraid, and how his blood boiled. That moment changed him forever. It burned away doubt, hesitation, and fear. It left behind a father with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. And protect her he did. Not just with his fists or his words, but with relentless action. He faced off with the principal. He worked with the press. He refused to be silenced. He learned that real protection wasn't about keeping your child from every pain. It was about standing beside them through it and never letting them feel alone. As the seasons changed, so did Lucy. She began therapy. She started drawing again, pictures filled with bright colors instead of gray shadows. She even asked to go back to school, a new one, and when Anthony dropped her off that first morning, she turned, smiled, and waved. No tears, no hesitation, just courage in tiny sneakers. Anthony stayed in the car a few minutes longer, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes brimming with emotion. He had won the battle, but the war against silence, against abuse, against corruption, it still waged on. But now, he was ready. Now, he wasn't alone. He began speaking publicly at school board meetings, at conferences, at parent groups. His story, Lucy's story, had become a rallying cry. His voice shook at first, but over time it grew stronger, steadier. He wasn't just telling a story anymore. He was building a legacy, a shield for other children, a warning for other schools, a reminder that parents are never powerless when they fight with love and truth on their side. In the end, it wasn't just about justice. It was about healing, about reclaiming the stolen piece of a child's heart, about turning pain into purpose. Anthony looked at his daughter every day now and saw not a victim, but a survivor. A little girl who had been to hell and back, and who now danced freely in the safety her father carved out for her, step by painful step. And in that quiet strength, in every smile she gave, he found something worth fighting for, not just for his daughter, but for every child who ever needed someone to believe them. When Anthony finally stood in front of the crowd at the community center, surrounded by parents, teachers, activists, and reporters, the reality of what he had fought for finally settled into his chest, not as a burden, but as a quiet, proud weight. Just months before, he had been a father silently watching his daughter Lucy retreat further and further into herself, her spark dimmed by a fear she was too young to name. He had held her trembling frame in the darkness of her bedroom, promising her safety while knowing deep down he didn't yet have the power to guarantee it. But now he was no longer alone, and neither was she. The story had begun with a small blue hair clip and a gut feeling. Lucy, only 7, had gone from a cheerful, bright-eyed child to a quiet, haunted version of herself. She clung to her father with silent desperation, asking impossible questions like whether he'd still love her if she wasn't a good girl. Something was wrong. Anthony saw it in her eyes. And even when the school brushed it off, and the teacher, Mrs. Dawson, smiled that too cold smile and dismissed Lucy as sensitive, Anthony couldn't shake the dread in his heart. So he acted. He hid a recording device in her hair clip. He broke the law, and he found the truth. The recording shattered him. He sat alone in his office, fists clenched, as his daughter's tiny voice shook through his speakers. The slap, the cruel words, the threats, the manipulation. Mrs. Dawson had not only abused Lucy, she had psychologically broken her, convincing her that telling the truth would take her father away, that if she spoke out, she'd end up alone. It wasn't just abuse. It was calculated emotional torture. Anthony cried that night, not just from rage, but from heartbreak. But he didn't stay down. Fueled by fury and love, he confronted the school, only to be met with more threats this time from Principal Harris. "You have no idea who you're up against," the man had warned, smug and shielded by connections. Anthony didn't care. He punched Harris in the face, and he would have done more if his best friend Charles hadn't pulled him back. Violence wasn't the answer, but the truth was. So he turned to someone who could help bring it into the light, investigative journalist Daniel Ramsey. Together they gathered evidence, testimonies, photos, audio. They built a case strong enough to shake the very foundations of the school district. When the first article went public, Anthony held his breath. The world didn't just read it roared. Support poured in. Parents came forward. Students who had suffered in silence finally spoke. Mrs. Dawson's empire of fear crumbled overnight. But exposing one predator was never the whole point. What Anthony uncovered was a system that protected its own, a system that silenced victims and punished whistleblowers. That's what he stood against now, not just one teacher, but every institution that turns its back on the innocent. And as more articles dropped, as media attention grew, the authorities finally acted. Mrs. Dawson was arrested. Principal Harris was suspended. A full-scale investigation was launched into the school board's past cover-ups. Through it all, Anthony remained centered on the one thing that had started it all: his daughter. Lucy was healing. Slowly, yes, but she was healing. She smiled more. She slept through the night. She stopped checking the door 3 times before bed. And the day she asked him if she could go back to school safely, to a new classroom, with a new teacher, Anthony cried, because she trusted again, because she believed in the protection he had promised her. And now, as he stood in front of the crowd, Anthony shared every raw detail. Not because it was easy, but because silence had once been the weapon used against them. His voice cracked as he told Lucy's story. The abuse, the fear, the resilience. And as he spoke, he saw tears in the eyes of other parents, nods of understanding from survivors, and quiet sobs from teachers who had once looked the other way. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a call to action. When he finished, the crowd stood. Applause wasn't what he was after, but it told him something powerful. They heard him. They believed him. And more importantly, they were ready to stand with him. In that moment, Anthony realized this wasn't the end of a nightmare. It was the beginning of a movement, a promise that children like Lucy would never be left to suffer in silence again. And as he walked off that stage, he saw Lucy in the front row, her face lit with pride, her hand waving wildly, her voice rising above the crowd. "That's my daddy." And that more than justice, more than headlines, was the greatest victory of all. Anthony had always believed that being a father meant more than just providing. It meant protecting, guiding, and standing firm, even when the world seemed to crumble. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the silent terror he saw in his daughter's eyes. 7-year-old Lucy had once been sunshine wrapped in freckles, skipping through the halls of their home with laughter in her wake. But slowly, that light had dimmed. Her shoulders hunched, her voice quieted. She clung to him more often and avoided school with an intensity that frightened him. The final blow came one morning when she asked, "Daddy, if I'm not a good girl, will you still love me?" That question, soaked in fear and shame, shattered Anthony's heart, and it told him something dark was happening where she should have been safest. When he installed a hidden recorder into her favorite sky blue hair clip, it was a desperate act, maybe even illegal. But Anthony couldn't stand idly by anymore. What he heard later that night turned his blood cold. The voice of Mrs. Dawson, her teacher, rang through the speakers like a villain from a nightmare. Cold, calculated, cruel. She slapped Lucy, called her worthless, manipulated her with threats about orphanages and police, and twisted her young mind with fear. And Lucy, his brave little girl, took it all in silence, protecting him because she believed the lie that if she spoke up, she would lose him forever. Fueled by a rage he'd never known, Anthony marched to Principal Harris's door demanding action. But the system wasn't built to protect kids like Lucy, it was built to protect predators like Dawson. The principal smirked, belittled the evidence, and warned Anthony to back down or risk losing custody of his child. That threat lit a fire in him. He punched Harris in the face, not out of impulse, but from the sheer weight of helpless fury. And still, he knew that wasn't the path to justice. So he pivoted. He called Charles, his lifelong friend, who connected him with investigative journalist Daniel Ramsey, a man known for exposing the dark corners others feared to look into. The story grew beyond just Lucy. Ramsey's report revealed a systemic pattern of abuse and silencing within the school. Parents came forward, students shared whispered traumas, and when the first article dropped, the internet exploded. It was no longer just Anthony's fight, it had become a collective outcry. Television networks picked it up. Social media trended with hashtags demanding Dawson's removal. Within days, the school suspended her and opened an internal investigation. But Anthony knew that wouldn't be enough. Predators didn't stop because they were suspended. They stopped when they were exposed, when they faced consequences, when the people they had silenced finally roared. Lucy, in the meantime, began to feel the shift. The fear in her eyes dulled, replaced by cautious hope. She didn't speak of Dawson, not yet, but she started sleeping through the night. She asked if she could help Anthony cook breakfast again. She even hummed once while brushing her hair. They were tiny things, but to Anthony, they were miracles. He knew healing wasn't linear, it was laced with scars, but it was happening, and it fueled his every move. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of interviews, press conferences, and community meetings. Anthony spoke not just for his daughter, but for every child who had suffered in silence. He stood on stages with a microphone in hand, trembling but resolute, telling Lucy's story to packed rooms. He named names. He read quotes from the recording. He showed the pendant Lucy had worn, still dented from being clutched in fear. And people listened, not just politely, but passionately. They cried. They stood. They acted. Then came the turning point. Police confirmed the investigation. More recordings surfaced. More children came forward. The evidence against Dawson was overwhelming. She was arrested. Principal Harris, too, faced charges for negligence and obstruction. The school board was forced to publicly apologize. A district-wide review was launched. New policies were implemented, and the culture of silence that had once cloaked the hallways began to lift. Anthony never sought the spotlight. He just wanted to protect his little girl. But in doing so, he became a symbol for something bigger, a movement of parents refusing to be ignored, of communities demanding accountability. He stood in front of his daughter one evening, tears in his eyes, as she whispered, "You saved me, Daddy." And he knew, right then, that everything, the sleepless nights, the fear, the public fight, it had all been worth it, because Lucy was safe, and justice had found its way through the darkness. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that silence in the face of wrongdoing only allows harm to grow. As we age, many of us have seen moments in life where speaking up felt risky, whether in families, communities, or institutions. But this story reminds us that protecting the vulnerable, especially children, is a moral duty that transcends fear or convenience. Anthony's courage to stand up for his daughter, despite being threatened by those in power, shows that justice often begins with one person refusing to back down. For older adults, this story carries an even deeper message, that wisdom gained over the years must be used to guide, protect, and empower the younger generations. Our voices steady with experience and rich with life lessons are needed now more than ever. Whether it's supporting a struggling family member, mentoring a child, or challenging injustice in quiet corners of our communities, our age gives us not only the right, but the responsibility to act with conviction. This story reminds us that it's never too late to do what's right, and that love, when paired with courage, can spark change in even the darkest places. Let us remember, we may not be able to undo every hurt from the past, but we can still choose to be a force for good today. Thank you for watching this important discussion on protecting our kids. Awareness and proactive action are key to safeguarding our children in today's digital landscape. We encourage you to stay informed and vigilant. If you found this video helpful, please like it and subscribe to our channel, Stories TH, for more content dedicated to child safety and parental guidance.